Hello and welcome to Feedstuffs 365 and National Hog Farmer. I'm Ann Hess. People connect, share culture and heritage, and create memories with each other through food. But no matter how poetic or aspirational people are with their food, they balance their emotions alongside the realities of daily life. Across the board, people are motivated by three things: taste, balance, and convenience. For Pork Checkoff, knowing the consumer means connecting pork to what they want and need in the most relevant way to them. Joining us to discuss the new North Star for pork and National Pork Board's Consumer Connect is Bill Evans, CEO, and David Newman, Senior Vice President of Market Growth, both with the National Pork Board. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Ann.
Before we jump into today's discussion, I'd like to remind the audience tuning in you can post your questions at any time in the chat, or if you are tuning in via social media, please post those there in the comments. So, Bill, let's start with you and start talking about that changing consumer. How's the National Pork Board is responding with this new North Star for pork?
Well, thank you, Ann. And from a pork checkoff point of view, there's an adage that I've been using that I got from an old friend of mine, and that is in agriculture, change is inevitable. However, adaptation and survival are optional. And I think that's the point that we find ourselves in the U.S. pork industry. We came out of COVID with actually some surprisingly high prices. And that quickly turned negative, and the past couple of years have been very difficult for our producers out there in the countryside. And so the pork board, getting in front of this, actually started doing some really deep diving in the data of where are today's consumers at, how are they at in a post-COVID environment, and how are they dealing with food price inflation, and what do the modern consumers want and what do they need? And that's a lot of the work that David Newman has been leading as our Senior Vice President of Market Growth. And he can go into the details of this Consumer Connect piece that's going to allow us to be much more targeted with the producers' dollars as we look at building demand for the future consumer.
Yeah, David, let's talk about that Consumer Connect. I understand there's 7 different segments of the US population and they're each aligned with a growth strategy. Tell us more about this initiative.
Sure. Thank you, Ann. Well, what it really boils down to is understanding who the future consumer of pork is, and really taking a look at where the consumers are today. If you think about the traditional consumer of pork in this country, the baby boomer generation has carried a significant amount of the weight when it comes to purchasing power and consumption over the last 2 or 3 decades. And now, as the younger generations, in particular millennials and Gen Zs, are the ones with young families. They're the ones who are primarily in the workforce, so they're a major contributor to the economy. They think, act, and eat differently than their parents and their grandparents, almost to a dramatic level. So when you think about what we do at the National Pork Board in terms of promotion of the only thing we produce, which is an edible product, being pork, this is about understanding who that consumer is. So not just saying millennial and Gen Zs are important to us, but saying among millennials and Gen Zs, what do those consumers break out and look like? And you mentioned those 7 segments, which is important. And I'll just briefly walk you through them quickly so people can kind of start to understand which one am I? And here's where this goes. The first one are called confident meat eaters. Those are people who say, I've got this. They know meat. They know how to cook meat. We just need to remind them to purchase more often amongst the other proteins that they have in their decision set. The second would be tasty value seekers. Those are people who are looking to stretch their dollar, people who are thinking about pieces or the number of heads they need to feed, for 3 meals a day. So thinking about the economics aspect of this business. The third is culinary adventures. By the way, I'm a culinary adventurer in the typing tool, and that says up for the challenge. And when you think about up for the challenge, these are people who think about potentially pork as an ingredient and not just center of the plate, something they would put on a salad, something they would put in ramen, something they might cook in a way that the boomer generation never did, using technology like sous vide or an air fryer as an example. The fourth one would be mindful choice makers. These are people who really think a lot about making conscious decisions and choices. So human nutrition is very important to them. So we need to remind them about the nutritional aspects of pork as a food. And then we have a category called simple feeders. They're described quite literally as just get me through this meal. I'm just here to be fed. I'm not interested in how it was cooked or why it was cooked. And that's the simple feeder category, which I think Bill falls into. The meat minimizer category is the next one. And meat minimizers are people who are actually looking for alternative proteins. They're looking for alternatives to meat. So they may not be our focus area. They're really not our primary focus area, where it's not about the food, but they are concerned about things around the environment and sustainability. So we could target messaging to them, maybe not trying to convince them to eat meat, but rather to convince them that what farmers are doing every day is good for the people, good for the pigs, and good for the planet. And then we have the last one, which is cultural celebrators. And these are a group of individuals amongst the segment that says connections matter the most. And this is really a primary audience that we're already focusing on a daily basis. And that is the multicultural audiences in this country, which have been 80% of the growth in the last decade and will be 80% plus of the growth in the next decade. So making that pork really culturally relevant. So think about audience around Hispanic, African American as an example. Those are important. So this research, Anne, is quite honestly about taking a very targeted approach to the market and not just taking a shotgun approach with producers' dollars, because we take that very seriously in how we allocate them. And that's what's different today versus what we've done in the past, utilizing the research and the technology we have to focus on the consumer of the future.
Boy, you have me thinking, which one am I? And I'm almost thinking a couple maybe are overlapping. But Bill, this targeted approach, why is it so pivotal for the pork industry?
Well, as David had indicated earlier, and in the past, if you go back in the checkoff history, you might have done billboards, you might have done print advertisements, things that would have been traditional media. You had 3 TV stations you could advertise on, and you could get to that mass market in that generic sense. But it was very difficult to actually get the data and understand what's my return on investment, how many eyeballs actually saw this, and more importantly, did that translate into a sale of pork? The beauty of today, as well as I would say the work of today, is understanding how do you do that inside of the digital world. So our ability, even this technologist platform right here with a video podcast, these type of technologies literally didn't exist just a few years ago. And not only is our ability then to use the producer dollars in a very, I would say, very measured and direct manner, delivering the messages to the people where they're at, not what we want them to know, but what are they curious about and how they want to eat, and help them understand how pork fits into that. That's much easier to do today, and it's much easier for us to track what's working and what's not, do A/B testing on messages, and we can quickly pivot when we see something that's really resonating. And I think that's the beauty of having the horsepower behind this very deep longitudinal study of tomorrow's consumers. And I just give you one example. So my mom she'll be 91 here in August. So she's part of that greatest generation, silent generation. I've got a number of cousins that are baby boomers. I'm Gen X, and I've got kids that are millennials and Gen Z. All of us look at pork as a food, and we're all meat eaters. But if you showed my mother a picture of an ad that featured a pork shoulder with a price point on it, she would know what to do with it, what it is, and understand that that's a real value proposition. Now you take that same traditional ad perhaps and put that in front of my 24-year-old daughter, Jill, who lives in Chicago, who loves to cook and knows how to cook. That can be intimidating. And the pork board is doing some basic blocking and tackling with David's team in that supply chain to help us understand how do you get the picture of the food, How do you get a cooking appliance in there that my daughter would use? And how do you put a QR code that drives you to a recipe, or even simpler, click the button, add it to the cart, and it's easy to pick up when I come home from work? That's the sort of things that maybe to today's pork producers might not see the billboards and the TV ads and the radio ads. Rest assured, there is a lot of direct work going out to people that we're trying to talk to. And David can get into much more detail on how that actually works.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of sounds, you're meeting consumers at their generational or their segment level, at their comfort level, really, with getting them the tools and things they need. So, David, what are the four consumer segments that the industry is going to focus on, and how is that going to build long-term demand?
Sure, it's a great question. So there, we will focus on all seven segments because we understand where they're at, but we need to think about today where we can win the most, and especially when we think around fresh pork, which is at risk much more than processed pork is. And an example of that, and I think I've mentioned that to you before, is consumers believe that bacon is its own food group. And so bacon is alive and well, right? When we think about processed foods, but when we think about fresh pork, there's a big risk there. So the confident meat eaters, the culinary adventurers, the mindful choice makers, and the simple feeders. And the reason why those are the primary targets is because they're the largest percent of US households. They're also the largest percentage of meat case sales. So we need to go after volume and value. And that's really important when we think about that. And so the next step is taking these insights and turning them into action. And our board of directors recently allocated funds, checkoff funds, and we are about to launch a new consumer-facing umbrella campaign. So on top of the work that we're doing that Bill mentioned with retailers and food service companies and packer processors, we're also going to take a market approach and really go out and be able to focus very specifically on the consumer with a large scale campaign so that we can improve pork's relevance. And that is an important thing because you mentioned in the beginning, taste and flavor, balance, so nutrition, and then also convenience are the things that matter to them. I say this every day. We only have one item to produce in this industry. That's very important. And two, consumers have more choices than they've ever had. So making it a relevant option for them and their families is going to be important for the long-term position for U.S. pork.
So obviously we have to take it back to the producer and those pork checkoff dollars. Bill, why is this important for producers? What's the one thing that they should know about this targeted approach?
Well, first off, as David had mentioned, the incoming generations do have questions about fresh pork. And the Pork Checkoff was created nearly 40 years ago to actually work on research, promotion, and education for the industry. And while we build trust with consumers to make sure that they feel comfortable about our producers on their farms and how they're raising the pigs, the pressure right now on us, particularly coming out of the tough financial spot, is really driving the demand side of the equation. And that's the add value. How do we add value to the U.S. pork producer? That's our job. Many of us here working at the pork board come from farms ourselves, myself and David included. Many of us are currently actively farming as well. And so we have that direct connection to the people and that understanding and that responsibility back to the folks that are paying our salaries and equally importantly, putting their hard-earned dollars at work. And I would say our 15-member producer board of directors is laser focused on the demand side of the equation and how we add value. And they are taking the producers' checkoff dollars, making good decisions based on data, and then handing that over to David's team and saying, go put this stuff in market and let's do something new and bold. And that's on the demand side.
Very good. I want to remind our audience, if you have any questions, you can post those there for Bill and David in the chat or in the comments there in your social media. As we wrap up here, I'd like to ask you both any final comments about this campaign and just the future of U.S. pork and domestic demand.
I'll tell you what, I'll start,
Yeah,
and
go ahead, David.
I'll just say briefly that the last couple of years has been the toughest times and the darkest days for our producers that we've ever seen in this business, and we're keenly aware of that. So I'm about to come up on 1 year at the pork board, and I've told Bill and many producers this many times that we've got a team here that's very dedicated to making the long-term strategy for pork work. And we're not going to forget about the short-term strategy, because if you're launching a new umbrella campaign and you think about going after the long-term consumption or consumer, that is a long-term game, and you've really got to stay in it for the long term to win it. In the short term here, we have a lot of efforts deployed around short-term demand that can help drive both volume and value. So I'm proud to work for the producers in this country, and we're going to keep pushing hard for them every day on this demand situation.
I would say, and I've been here at the pork board now for 8 years, and one of the hardest lessons for me to learn, and most important lesson for me to learn, is that on our farm operation in South Dakota, you can make a decision, direct it, and bang, you're working on it in the afternoon. The level and scale of the work and the complexity in the supply chains, both domestically and internationally, you have to have the data, you have to have the team, and you have to have the business plan, and you have to have the backing of the producer board. These things all have to come into play, because the last thing we want to do is just throw something against the wall with their producer hard-earned dollars just to say you're doing something. I view that would be a dereliction of duty on our part. And so the diligence that David's team has applied to this, and really making sure we're making sound business decisions that pencil out with their dollars, that is really what drives our decision making here with our board of directors. And so we've got the data, we've built the team, we've got a strategic direction now, and the board is allocating the dollars. The work now comes into deciding what that consumer campaign is actually going to say and look like, and then getting that in market with our 42 state pork associations, as well as our really key partners out there on the ground. So I'm really excited about this. It's the expectations of the owners of this industry, and we're eager to get to work on their behalf.
And we're excited to hear more about this campaign and future developments with it. Bill Even and David Newman with the National Pork Board, thank you for joining us today to share that insight, and we look forward to hearing more about this project in the future.
Thanks, Ann. Appreciate it.
For you and our audience, we thank you for tuning in today. For more coverage and conversations on pork industry related topics, be sure to check out the live and on demand section of Feedstuffs 365. For Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.